Hi YouTube, my name is Scott and I'm going to tell you how you can read more of the books that you want to read every single year. I have an undergraduate degree in English literature and continental philosophy and a master's degree in humanities. I've been teaching at university for a couple years now. I think this video will be really useful for you no matter where you're at in your reading journey, whether you're a new reader, whether you're a returning reader, maybe you're a student who has a long reading list and you still want to read for fun. No matter where you're at here, I've got you covered. This video ended up being a little longer than I thought. The first part of the video is really going to be a discussion of why we ought to read more, what it means to read more, why we count how many books we read, whether we should count how many books we read, that sort of thing. If you just want to get right into my tips for reading more, feel free to skip to that section. Why should you read more? If you're watching this video, chances are you're already an avid reader, or at least you're someone who's interested in reading more. You should have some understanding about why you personally want to read more, what reading more really means to you. Now, there are arguments to be made that reading more improves things like your vocabulary and your empathy, but I find those to be really quite utilitarian arguments. They're more interested in the benefit you get out of reading rather than the sort of joy of reading itself, right? Reading for its own sake rather than for some other purpose. There are lots of different ways to put this, but I love this quote from George R.R. Martin, A Dance with Dragons. "A reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies. The man who never reads lives only one." Reading really allows us to actually play with ideas. We get to imagine what it's like to live another life or to think differently than how we do. It's like trying on clothes, but we're trying on ideas instead. By living 1,000 lives, reading allows us to consider other perspectives, and through considering other perspectives, refine our own. Martin certainly isn't the first to express this idea, and he will definitely not be the last. C.S. Lewis, in An Experiment in Criticism from 1961, wrote, "But in reading great literature, I become 1,000 men, and yet remain myself." So these are really beautiful quotes about reading. I don't want to dwell too much on them. I think that there's joy in reading for its own sake. But whatever motivates you to read, you're here because you want to read more. So I want to switch gears a little bit and pose to you this hypothetical. Most of us won't live to see 100. I'm not going to argue about modern medicine and all that. If you only read a single book per year from now until the end of your life, you won't even be able to make it through a list like the BBC's Big Read, BBC's top 100 books. A lot of us probably wouldn't even get halfway through that list at one book a year. So about 50 books, that is maybe a shelf and a half from the bookshelf behind me. That's it. That's all you get for the rest of your life at one book a year. A shelf and a half. Think of all the stories that go unread there. What do you choose? What gets left behind? Of course, there's an easy solution to this. We can read more, right? Which is why you're here, which is why I'm trying to read more, which is why you're trying to read more. And we want to experience more of those stories. How many books should you read each year? There's no magic number of books you should read each year. Of course, the more hobbies you have, the less time you're able to dedicate to each one. So it might be that you have a lot of other interests besides reading. So naturally, you're going to have a bit less time to read. That's okay. It's also okay if you're not reading 100 books, over 100 books a year. That's totally fine, right? Don't let people tell you otherwise. You're watching this video because you like reading, because you want to read more. Don't let somebody else tell you how many books is or is not enough to read. Be content simply to read and to read more. So I've noticed this trend on Book Talk and BookTube. I guess it's not really a trend. It seems kind of standard to count how many books you read each year. Or if you're not counting in a spreadsheet or keeping a list or something like that, people will use Goodreads or Storygraph to keep track of all the books that they've read. I'll say right out of the gate. If that brings you joy, keep doing it. Go for it. Don't let me or anyone else tell you otherwise. But I want all of us, to remember that reading isn't a competition. It's not a race. We're reading because we are readers, because we love to read. Now, I don't read nearly as many books as some influencers I've seen, and that's okay. I've probably got through somewhere between 30, maybe 40 books this year. I don't know the exact number because I don't count and I don't keep track of it on Goodreads or Storygraph or anything like that. I have no idea. I would guess around 30 or 40. If you do count your books, let me know in the comments why and how many books you've read this year. For me, personally, I don't find counting the books that I'm reading very useful. So it's something that I don't do. Now, before I jump into my criticism of counting books, I just want to say again, for everybody, if counting books is something that makes you really happy, brings you joy, you love to do it, you love to keep track of these sorts of things, by all means, go for it. Do not let anybody, especially some random person on the internet, tell you otherwise. I'm just going to explain why I don't find it personally useful for me. And maybe if there are some viewers who don't really like the idea of counting books or it stresses them out, why they maybe shouldn't worry about doing that. For simplicity's sake, let's say you only manage to read 5 books in 1 year. Well, what does 5 books look like? 5 books can look very different depending on what you're reading. Here's War and Peace, The Lord of the Rings, Don Quixote, Lonesome Dove, and Infinite Jest. Now here's 5 other books you could have read instead. Never Let Me Go, No Country for Old Men, Legends and Lattes, Piranesi, and The Alchemist. One of these stacks has significantly more volume than the other. Now we shouldn't just judge these books by their length. The fact is though that one of those stacks is just going to take significantly longer to get through than the other. And at the end of the day, when you count your books, you're going to have the same count, right? Each stack counts for 5. But that number 5 isn't really representative of the volume that you've gotten through, the volume of reading that you've done. Now, in addition to just sheer volume, sheer length, some books are also significantly easier to get through than others. Here's my ripped up volume of The Way of Kings, repackaged into 4 books. Now this, The Way of Kings, is a lot easier to get through than Infinite Jest, a book that I've found completely impenetrable so far, but I'm gonna read it eventually. So some books are easier to read, but again, they count the same, they count for 1. It's also not clear how some books should be counted. I mentioned Lord of the Rings earlier. Tolkien originally intended to publish The Lord of the Rings as 1 volume, but his publisher had it split into 3. And you can often find it sold today in either 1 or 3 volumes. Does it count as 1 book or 3 books? Or are you counting all of the books in the 3 volumes, so it's actually 6 books? Another example might be manga, basically Japanese comics, for those of you who don't know. I started reading some manga this year. I was reading the Berserk Deluxe editions. Now, these are basically 3 of the original volumes reprinted in a single volume deluxe edition. So does this count as 1 or 3 books? Or does it not count as any books because it's a manga? Now there's absolutely nothing wrong with preferring shorter, easier books. That's completely fine, and there's a lot of value in a lot of those books. I worry that counting books encourages us to seek out those short, easy titles that will grow our book count faster. So don't worry too much about counting books. If it's something that you really love, by all means, go ahead. But if you're not really into counting how many books you read, you're in good company. I think that there's a lot of value in not worrying about your book count. Instead, you should focus on enjoying the time that you spend reading. Okay, I promised some tips. So here are 7 tips to read more books. Tip 1, keep multiple books in progress at once. I regularly hear from people that they only have 1 book on the go at any time. This is a really quick way to kill your progress. Some people look at me Like I have two heads when I say this. How can you be reading multiple books at once? Don't you get confused? Let me try to explain my thoughts here. When I was in school, a full semester involved 5 courses. During that semester, we would have at least one book on the go for each of those 5 courses. So that's a total of somewhere between 5 and 10 books or stories on the go at any one time. Now, I had to learn to juggle those books to keep up with the reading assignments. So it's something I had to practice, and I think it's something that other people could get into if they gave it a try, tried to have a couple books on the go at once. People will watch multiple TV series all the time and be able to keep up with what's going on, no problem, when they jump back and forth between different TV series. I think with practice, a book is pretty similar to that. Most books aren't like movies. When you watch a movie, you're kind of committed to the 2 or 3 hour experience. We tend to read books piece by piece instead. So we're getting little pieces here and there, maybe a chapter at a time, a couple chapters at a time. I think the structure of a lot of books makes for a lot of natural rest points, stopping points that we can pause, kind of go to our other book, or keep going if we want to, right? You don't need to switch to another book. Now, here's why I think having multiple books on the go can be really important. When we have multiple books that we're reading, we're less likely to bounce off reading entirely if we get bored of one. I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but if you have multiple books on the go, then you can switch to the one that you're presently finding more interesting if it's going to keep you reading. Reading multiple books at once also helps with tip 2. Tip 2. Read in different ways. So don't limit yourself just to ebooks or just to physical books. Try to branch out a bit and take advantage of all the different ways that we can read today. I have the Kindle app set up on my phone. I have the icon really large so that it draws my attention whenever I open my phone. I mostly use the Kindle app to sneak in a little bit of reading time in places where I wasn't expecting to have time to read, where I just have my phone on me, I can open it up, I see the Kindle app there, I can jump in, I can get through a couple paragraphs maybe. I also like reading and collecting physical books, of course. I usually save reading physical books for when I'm at home, but sometimes I'll take one with me if I'm really enjoying it, if I'm going someplace or doing a little bit of traveling, some light traveling. I also have an e-reader that I use as a bedtime and travel device. I find a lamp is often too bright for my wife who's sleeping next to me, and I've never really found a book light that I like. So having that backlight on the e-reader is something that I find really, really useful. Of course, e-readers also make great travel companions because you can take so many books with you at once. If you're going somewhere for more than a few days, a couple weeks, you might want to have several books with you, and there's no better way than an e-reader to carry that many books at once. And finally, I use audiobooks. Whenever I'm commuting or if I'm doing chores, washing dishes, vacuuming, anything like that, I can throw on an audiobook. You can find plenty of audiobooks online. If you're using a service like Audible, I recommend using those Audible credits on longer books. I'll usually choose audiobooks that give me about 40 to 50 hours of listening time per credit, and I find that keeps it pretty affordable for me. Tip 3, don't be afraid to DNF a book. DNF stands for did not finish. One of the most common problems I see for new and returning readers is that they're unwilling to give up on a book that they just don't like anymore. I'm not saying you guys shouldn't give books a chance. You absolutely should give them a chance. But if reading has become torture, maybe it's time to let go. It's better to let go of one book than to let that book frustrate you so much that you just get turned off from the idea of reading entirely. If you get stuck on one book you don't like, you're more likely to bounce off reading entirely, and that is something that we are absolutely trying to avoid. Tip 4, try other genres. I grew up reading Geronimo Stilton and Warriors. By middle school, I had switched to fantasy. I was getting a lot of those 70s, 80s, 90s genre fantasy books from my uncle at the time, and I was just devouring those. And I really considered myself, as a kid growing up, a fantasy reader. I didn't really want to engage with other genres. I just wanted to engage with fantasy. Now, fortunately, I was exposed to other genres through school, and it's through school that I gave these other books a chance. In high school, I really fell in love with A Tale of Two Cities. In my first year of university, we were reading The Remains of the Day, this guy right here. But I just fell in love with this quiet but powerful mid-20th century portrait of a butler and the English countryside. I also used to think that Canadiana wasn't for me. I didn't really like Canadian authors, or at least I thought I didn't. I did end up taking a Canadian literature course because I'm Canadian, and I found my favorite Canadian author, Margaret Laurence, The Diviners. So if you find it difficult to branch out on your own, maybe try auditing a college course, a college literature course. You could also just look for some recommendations online. You might discover a whole new genre of books that you love. Tip 5, read with others. If you have friends who have similar interests as you, start a book club, even if it's just the two of you. And this could be one of the multiple books you have on the go at once. You could do a slow read with a friend for a book club, and you could have something else on the go for yourself. This is also a great way to try new genres if your friend is maybe interested in a genre that you haven't given a shot before. If you don't know anybody who's interested, try your local bookstores or your local libraries. You can find book clubs that way a lot of the times. And if you still can't find anything, look for online communities. The Tolkien fans subreddit did a read-along of The Lord of the Rings in 2023. So you can find sort of online communities and book clubs like that as well. When we do things with others, we're more likely to keep up and follow through. Tip 6, get a library card. This might go without saying for you avid readers, but for new and returning readers, they often overlook the library card. Do not sleep on how valuable a library card can be. Browsing a library can be like browsing a bookstore, but everything is free. Reading doesn't need to be an expensive hobby. My local library offers library cards for free, so you can borrow books freely. Money does not need to be a barrier to reading. Tip 7, be consistent. This is probably the tip I've seen repeated most often, and that's for a good reason. Assuming an average reading speed of 300 words per minute and an average page length of about 300 words per page, you can get through about 30 pages just by reading for 30 minutes before you go to bed. If we multiply that by the number of days in the year, we get a staggering 11,000 pages that you can read. That's 22 500-page books for just 30 minutes a night. Let's say you have a 30-minute commute every day as well. Now, if you're listening to an audiobook for that 30 minutes, now you're reading for 30 minutes before bed, listening to an audiobook for 30 minutes on your way to work. You're doubling your reading. That's like 44 books a year. Now, we do tend to read faster in our head than out loud, so the narrating might be slower than you could have read the book, so maybe it doesn't quite double how much you're reading. But the point still stands. If you're consistent with your reading habits, it might surprise you how many books you can actually get through. The previous numbers might also vary depending on your reading speed, the printing of the book, and the length of the book. I still think they're a really good example of how consistency pays off. Thank you all for joining me. I hope you found something thoughtful or useful here. Let me know in the comments below what you're most excited to read in 2025. Happy holidays, everybody, and I'll see you next time.